guys see the mouse? This is between glasses and no glasses.
Yeah, that's it. You've got it. That's it.
No, I see.
That's it.
Doesn't want to do it. There we are.
Thank you.
And that's the clicker.
Thank you.
Cheers, mate.
Thanks, Tim. Hi, everybody. I'm Matthew Molineux. As Tim said, I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands, the Yuwi people, and pay my respects to elders past and present, and extend that respect to any First Nations people who might be, who are here today. I am currently studying, as Tim has said, a Bachelor of Visual Arts at the Queensland College of Art and Design. I commenced my visual arts studies in the middle of 2022, not so long ago, and to say it has been life-changing would be an understatement. I have another life as an occupational therapist and occupational therapy academic, and although that profession is actually grounded in the arts and crafts movement, my artistic life really only started in 2022. Interestingly, creating the book that I'm talking about today was probably the first opportunity in my creative practice to date that I've been able to integrate my two lives, because I'm an occupational therapy researcher with expertise in qualitative research and a particular interest in narrative research approaches. My education and my work have been very much grounded in discursive knowledge, and so, as far as I know, I was not exposed to artist books until I started my print studies with Dr. Tim Mosley in the second half of 2023. In July last year, I attended an event jointly hosted by Cobalt Editions and the State Library of Queensland, where I got to see and touch artist books such as Vessels by Adele Outeridge, I Cannot See You by Anna Paula Estrada, and Maker's Mark by Helen Mueller. At that event, I could feel my brain creak as I engaged with those books and many others, because my idea of a book was challenged. I had edited and written books in my other life, and they were nothing like these. And I remember asking Tim at that event that question, if these are books, then what is a book? Today I want to talk to you about the first artist book that I've made, which is called Second of Three in 2023, which is in the fair this weekend. This book was created as part of my visual arts studies under the expert mentoring of Tim, but in developing my print practice, I also am very grateful to have learned from Michael Phillips, Dr. Matt Newkirk, Jonathan C., Professor Ross Woodrow, and Alethea Richter. So I just want to acknowledge them and thank them. I made the first version of this book around October last year, and based on feedback, I remade it this year. On Thursday, October 5th, 2023, my mother was admitted to hospital for surgery. I took the day off work, and my father and I waited at the hospital, and we kept my sister, who lived in Darwin at the time, up to date via text message and telephone calls throughout the day. Mum came out of surgery, went to intensive care briefly, fairly routinely. She recovered, and she recovered very well and very quickly, and there were no concerns. The next day, I went to QCAD Print Studio for the penultimate class of my very first print course. We were getting ready to show our final work the next week, in the last week of class, and my piece was a lino print series called The Hidden Labour of Printmaking. After class, I went to see Mum and spent the afternoon with her, and I took my lino prints to show her in the hospital room, and to show her and my father. Dad had been there all day, and so he went home late in the afternoon, and I stayed on and sat with Mum while she ate dinner. After a few bites, she started to cough, was unable to catch her breath, and became increasingly distressed. I found a nurse, and within minutes the room was full of, this is not an overstatement, 30 health professionals working on Mum while I watched in from the corridor through the door. She was quickly moved to intensive care. The mood was not positive, so I called my father and he came back to the hospital. Very late that night, my father and I were allowed to see Mum in intensive care. She was conscious and alert, but was intubated. The ventilator managed her breathing, but it meant that she could not speak. Instead, she wrote notes with whatever pen was at hand on photocopier paper that the nurses gave her. Mum was intubated and writing notes only for about 24 hours because she made a great recovery. I arrived Saturday and saw that she was no longer intubated and so wasn't communicating by writing. And I really don't know why, but for some reason I very quietly gathered all of those pieces of paper together and took them. And the other interesting thing, which I need to think more about, is they sat in my car for about 12 months until I did something with them. When I set out to make this book, I don't think I really knew what I was aiming at, and I didn't know what the outcome would be, but I knew from my experience with narrative research methods that adopting a narrative approach could be useful. As Mattingly and also Sabin suggest, stories have long been recognised as being a key way that humans make sense of their experiences and relationships. A narrative approach was therefore appropriate for me to use in seeking to make sense of this experience, because as Woolf very neatly summarises, narratives help us make sense. Part of the ability of narratives to do that is because they can help create a story that makes sense of experiences, particularly those that are troubling and disruptive. However, when thinking about this experience, I was initially mindful of wanting to tell this story in a way that was, for want of a much better word, truthful. This reminded me of the work of Portelli, who wrote about the death of Luigi Trastulli, who was killed in a workplace protest in Italy way back in 1949, and the different recollections that people who were at that event had. Portelli argued that there can be a difference between historical truth and narrative truth. The chronological, some might say objective sequence of events may not be the way that the individual configures the elements of the experience to make narrative sense. This meant that in creating the book, I was mindful of the tension between the story and the meaning being uncovered and the story and meaning being created or imposed. There was no order to Mum's pages or the notes. There was no temporal sequence. There were sometimes lines drawn which you can see to indicate one piece of text was linked to or separate from others. And uncertainty at the outset was for me, was I going to discover a story or create a story? When narrative approaches are combined with an artistic process, it is possible to see what Pollock has called an artistic alchemy at work which transforms a horrible experience. The result of this alchemy is seeing the trauma, but in a way that is moderated by the artistic activity. Louise Bourgeois is an artist who exemplifies this approach. It has been suggested that rather than shy away from the traumatic experiences, Bourgeois chose to return to those experiences to recreate them in different forms and mediums. And in doing so, Betterton suggests that her work can be seen as, to quote, calculated yet unpredictable staging of psychic processes. With the benefit of hindsight, I can now see that this is what happened to me. This was a truly awful experience. Seeing my mother so vulnerable, so fragile, and not knowing what the outcome would be was distressing. Seeing the impact on my father was also hard to witness. Making the book was challenging but also healing, but in very unpredictable ways. During the process of scanning the text, manipulating the images, preparing the screens, printing the pages of the book, I have swung between very different ways of relating with the words and the images. At times, they are just images I engage with purely artistically. Where should they be placed? What direction was it in the original? How large was it? At other times, I'm struck by the mundane concerns Mum seemed to have during this awful experience. There are other times, however, where I'm caught off guard because the words transport me right back to Mum's bedside, and I remember the choking, watching from the corridor, or sitting by her bed in intensive care. Although creating a story using the notes meant I was perhaps leaning into what some might see as the quintessential form for a narrative to assume, that is a book, I also knew from my studies and the Cobalt sessions at the State Library of Queensland that book could mean many things. Indeed, Carrion's conceptualisation of the book opens up a multitude of possibilities, powerfully summarised by him as a movement away from a writer writing texts to a writer making books. This resonated with me because it linked with the narrative idea of creating a story, not merely documenting a story. To make a book in this way, according to Carrion, is to actualise its ideal space-time sequence by giving careful thought to every part, the words, the space, the font, the colour, the paper, the binding, and so on. In order to understand it, the viewer must understand the structure as well as the elements that make up or are contained within the structure. I was very mindful of this when creating the book because I realised beyond creating a story about what happened, the book format also allowed me to create an experience for the viewer. So I considered carefully which phrases to use. I crafted a story that made sense to me, that captured the elements I found interesting or compelling. I thought carefully about what the sequence would be, how some pages would seem fuller than others. What also emerged through working in the studio was other elements that were not consciously planned by me, but perhaps emerged due to my tacit engagement with the experience and materials. The printing of the text makes some words look more delicate and tentative, which is reminiscent of what went on in intensive care, while other words seem more forceful and urgent, which is also reminiscent at times of what happened. While the original photo of Mum was a lovely, clear photo, preparing it for screen printing and then printing it makes Mum appear delicate and fragile. Just the other week, in fact, as I was finalising the book, I realised that the cut required to make the book cuts across Mum's mouth. Interesting into the circumstance. Unfortunately, I can take no credit for that. That just seemed to emerge through the making process. My parents have seen the book twice, partly because I want to share my creative practice, because it's become an important part of my life, but also because I'm very mindful of this being a story that is ours in some way, and that I am making public, and in fact very public at times, this story of ours. The first time I showed them was when I showed them an early mock-up of the book. I warned them that it was potentially quite confronting and handed it to Dad first. Dad turned the cover, read the first 2 to 3 pages, became upset and handed it back. I handed the book over to Mum and she started to read it, but she wanted to know when she wrote each phrase, why she wrote each phrase, what was happening at the time she wrote those words. I realised, and to be honest it was quite surprising at the time, that while I wasn't quite sure what I intended to do when I started making the book, I thought I was going to create a book about Mum's experience in intensive care, albeit seen through my eyes. My parents' reactions, however, made it clear that what I had actually done was create a book about the experience that Dad and I shared. The second time they saw the book was when I exhibited the first version at the end of last year in an exhibition at QCAD called Consecutive Concurrent, and their reactions were exactly the same. Dad couldn't read it and had to walk away, and Mum sat at the table that it was shown on to study it and wanted to talk about it. And we have talked about it. Having created a book and shared it in a few different ways now, I am struck by the power of the artist's book as a medium for processing experiences, just like Louise Bourgeois did with her work. Furthermore, understanding books from Carrion's perspective has revealed new ways to engage with words, stories, narratives, and books that my discursively trained mind could only imagine. Well, couldn't even imagine, but of course that makes sense. To end, I'd like to affirm what Estrada recognised, and that is that an artist's book can be used to capture characteristics of experiences which are often stripped away by traditional writing, transcription, or printing, which can actually distance the story from the teller and separate both from the reader. And I think that's what I've done in my book. Thank you.
And the books, you can see this book. I hope the book finds its way to many collections.